Meeting Monday with a punch. That was the concept behind this series of short videos, where I go through a range of Punch magazine illustrations in 4 volumes and give a little discussion around them, provide context, talk about why I like this illustration or that, what it means, talk a little about any of the accompanying text. That was the idea. I'd recently, not too long ago as I'm recording this, I'm recording in December 2025, I'd recently done my Punch old-timey book review, and I had posted a number of shorts edited from that where I discussed Punch magazine illustrations. People have shown some interest in these, so I thought to share with the world a few more Punch magazine illustrations that caught my interest, and I hope they'll interest you too. Punch was a satirical magazine, and so some of them are quite funny, but also some are quite sombre in their tone, as you shall see, if you have not already seen the shorts. So, without further ado, Meeting Monday with a Punch. I'll be back at the end of this compilation to give a little epilogue of sorts. I'm sure we've all experienced those times when we are thinking about where to go on holiday, and looking over the list of destinations, there are several pros and several cons. Now, this is a cartoon published on the 18th of July 1863. The illustration is by Sir John Tenniel, and it is titled Stay-at-Home Travellers. Now, why might you want to stay at home? Well, in 1863 there were quite a few good reasons. Let's read the text. Mr. John Bull consults his Continental Bradshaw. Where shall we go? Roars Mr. B to Mrs. One always doubts, but this year I've no notion. To run one's nose in rows is injurious, yet everywhere here's trouble or commotion. So glancing o'er the old world and the new, where as tourists we've been used to roam, I really think the wisest thing to do is, for this once, my dear, to stay at home. The illustration shows Mr. John Bull speaking to his wife about where they could possibly travel this year, and in the accompanying poem, as they reel off countries, it becomes clearer and clearer that there's far too much danger on the continent and elsewhere, and perhaps it's best to stay at home. Now, why might they think this way? Well, in 1863, and in much of the 1860s, there was a lot of discontent around. There was the ongoing American Civil War over in the New World, mentioned here. There were the German Wars of Unification. There was the Polish uprising against the Russians. There were wars for independence in Italy. I think this was between the second and the third. So you can see why a British traveller, when consulting their guidebook, might think it's best to stay at home. The guidebook mentioned is a Continental Bradshaw, and the Bradshaw guides, alongside the Murray guides, referenced in the poem, were both what we would think today as travel guidebooks, a form of publication that helps travellers with lists of railway times, possible locations to visit, accommodation that can be rented, and all sorts of such useful information. You know what a travel guide is. Well, these had only recently entered the publishing sphere as travel for leisure became more popular throughout the 1800s, with the coming of the railroads, allowing for much faster travel across country and across the continent. And so the fact that he's consulting a Bradshaw guide is really one of those domestic little things you would do if you were thinking of a holiday. But with all this disorder in the old world and in the new, it really was best to just stay at home. Not long after the American Civil War broke out, Britain declared its neutrality. They did so in May 1861, and by and large, the government kept to this. This is an illustration from October 3rd, 1863, and it satirises this policy. You see, while the British government, and generally speaking the business interests of the UK, felt it was best to stay neutral, the general public sentiment was leaning more towards the Union side because of their anti-slavery stance. But going back to the business interest, Much of Britain's textile trade relied heavily on the cotton from the southern states of the United States of America. Overall, as their parent nation, we seem to have thought that the Americans should sort themselves out with as little inconvenience to anyone else as possible. This is very much communicated in this cartoon, but I also get the sense that Punch is satirising Britain's focus on economic stability above all else. Here is the quote. "Look here, boys, I don't care twopence for your noise, but if you throw stones at my windows, I must thrash you both." You can see the northern states on the right dropping its stone on the ground so that John Bull doesn't tell him off, but the one on the left is still holding it in his hand, although facing away and trying to subtly keep it behind his back. The accompanying poem reads, "Mr. Bull to his American bullies. Hoy, I say, you two there kicking, up that row before my shop. Do you want a good sound licking, both? If not, you'd better stop. Peg away at one another if you choose such fools to be, but leave me alone, don't bother, bullyrag and worry me. Into your confounded quarrel, let myself be dragged I'll not. By you fighting for a moral tariff or your slavey lot. What I want to do with either is impartially to trade. Nonsense I will stand from neither, past the bounds of gasconade. You north roaring, raving, yelling, hold your jaw, you booby-doo. What, d'ye threaten me for selling arms to the south as well as you? South at me, don't bawl and bellow, that won't make me take your part. So you just be off, young fellow. Now, you noisy chap, to start. To be called names 'tis unpleasant, words however break no bones. I control myself at present, but beware of throwing stones. I won't have my shop windows broken, mind you brawlers what I say. See this stick, a striking token, cut your own, or civil stay." So what I get from this is the sense that John Bull is ready to tell off these naughty little children arguing in front of his shop, and to not disrupt his business. In the Punch issue of October 17th, 1863, we have this rather telling illustration. It's called The Storm Signal, and this is the text beneath. "We know not whence the storm may come, but it's coming in the air. And this is the warning of the drum, against the storm prepare." Here you see the goddess Britannia being blown by a blustery gale by the coast, setting up a storm drum which would warn those at land, and potentially at sea, of any coming storm, the wind blowing it into a racket. But what is this coming storm that Britannia's preparing for here? Well, wars are ongoing in Europe and in the United States of America with their civil war. There's the Polish uprising against Russia happening. There's the German wars of unification, Italian wars of independence, the rise of nationalist movements in Europe, the Schleswig wars between Prussia and Denmark, the second starting in February 1864, so not many months after this illustration was published. This illustration is a warning to prepare by the Punch artists, and it really does tell as to their knowledge of international affairs as illustrators and satirists as well as commentators, that they are aware of all these potential conflicts, but not quite sure where it will break out. The United Kingdom is a very stable country because of, well, the sea, amongst other factors, political and cultural, and so is not afraid that a conflict may break out here, or even at this time between any particular parties on the continent and them, but is aware that many countries in Europe are readying to declare war on their neighbours. You get a sense of all these conflicts that are either ongoing or potentially to happen in the near future from the poem on the opposite page and overleaf. "Up with the drum that storm forebodes, from the signal rigging flown, the only puzzle's about the modes in which to point the cone. For upwards tells of storms from east and downwards from westward blown. But if upwards or downwards who's to say, or opposite cones together, when clouds so bank and blacken each way, portending awful weather." Both the poem on the accompanying page and the text, as you can see on the cloud in the image, suggests the outbreak of war and the conflicts that are ongoing All Britannia can do is try to guess the direction from whence this storm will come and prepare accordingly. What are we to make of this scene of slaughter? What you see here in this Sir John Tenniel illustration is the three Furies pushing this almighty cannon across the battlefield, crushing all beneath it. It was not unusual for Punch artists to reference Greek mythology, so this is where the Furies comes in, but what this image gets across is the horror of war. As I mentioned, this illustration is by John Tenniel, and he is the illustrator most well known for his work on the first published edition of Alice in Wonderland, which was published a year later in 1865, a year after this illustration. You can see his fine detail work here and the expressiveness in his art. Although the tone is very different between this and Alice in Wonderland, both give across a very clear sense of a surreal world where people can get crushed by massive cannons or turn tiny, as in Alice in Wonderland. What I get from this illustration is just the pure sense of carnage that the writers and illustrators of Punch sensed over in America, although we here in Britain, those reading Punch magazine in September 1864, may not have understood all the ins and outs of the American Civil War. They could still express, as the writers and artists of Punch did, the sense of horror at the number of casualties from the conflict. The American juggernaut crushing all those in its wake. Caricaturist, cartoonist, illustrator John Leech died on the 29th of October 1864. He was perhaps most well known for his work in Punch magazine, although in retrospect his greatest legacy may be in the illustrations he did for Charles Dickens's first edition of A Christmas Carol, creating much of the visual iconography that all subsequent adaptations of that story have drawn upon. John Leech was born in 1817, but as his obituary is here, he died in 1864. That means he was only 47 years old at his death. This is the obituary that the Punch magazine writers wrote for him. The simplest words are best, where all words are in vain. 10 days ago, a great artist in the noon of life, and with his glorious mental faculties in full power, but with the shade of physical infirmity darkening upon him, took his accustomed place among friends who have this day held his pall. Some of them had been fellow workers with him for a quarter of a century, others fewer years, but to know him well was to love him dearly, and all in whose name these lines are written mourn as for a brother. His monument is in the volumes of which this is one sad leaf, and in 100 works which, at this hour, few will not remember more easily than those who have just left his grave. While society, whose every phrase he has illustrated with a truth, a grace, and a tenderness hitherto unknown to satiric art, gladly and proudly takes charge of his fame, they, whose pride in the genius of a great associate was equalled by their affection for an attached friend, would leave on record that they have known no kindlier, more refined, or more generous nature than that of him who has been thus early called to his rest. You can tell from the last line, speaking of him being early called to his rest, and also the phrase much earlier in this obituary, that he died in the noon of life, implies that he had much time left. This was not the twilight of his life, it was the middle. It should have been. There should have been many more years to come, many more illustrations to be made. John Leech may be dead. All those who wrote this obituary, dated the 4th of November but published November 12th, all these men are dead and gone, but their illustrations live on. I think it rather telling that they chose to do a traditional obituary rather than a full-page illustration. He was one of their own, and so they chose, as they say, the simplest words, because sometimes the simplest words are best when all words are in vain. I'll be perfectly honest when it comes to this illustration here. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. I've done some preliminary research around it, around the Colenso judgment. From what I can tell, it's a really rather complicated affair between two bishops in South Africa, both part of the Anglican Church, and a disagreement regarding both the interpretation of the Bible itself and of the powers of bishops and the right to excommunicate in South Africa at this time. The Bishop of Natal was John Williams Colenso, and he was not favoured at all by his church superiors in South Africa, who, when he was on a trip to England, I believe, decided to excommunicate him. Slightly rude, I'm sure you'd agree. The decision to excommunicate him was in response to a controversial biblical criticism that he published, which opposed the literal truth of the Old Testament and led to widespread alarm and opposition from the High Church party. The church superior that he offended in particular was the Bishop of Cape Town. Colenso had long been known as a peculiar sort of missionary, as he would not tell the newly Christianised Africans, like he was supposed to, that their ancestors, as they were not Christians, were therefore doomed to eternal damnation. He thought that kind of tact wasn't, well, particularly tactful. He also was a defender of the rights of Africans, and particularly of the Zulu peoples. He was a scholar of their language. And although this defence of Africans comes in that expected, slightly paternalistic way that Englishmen in the mid-1800s had when defending the rights of native peoples, he shouldn't be dismissed because of this. He was a true believer in treating them with respect, unlike some of his church superiors. I'm not quite sure what this means with the two blanks going into the Lord Chancellor's purse. If anyone in the comments wants to enlighten me what exactly this is satirising. The text beneath the illustration reads, "Colenso had no right to swear obedience to an empty chair, and Gray no title to exact a compact that was bosh in fact." So Gray was outdone, and it was decided that he could not excommunicate the Bishop of Natal, Colenso, and Colenso's return in fact led to a schism in the South African Church and that region. On the 14th of April 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the Ford Theatre in Washington. The illustrators of Punch magazine had long drawn various caricatures of Lincoln, especially during the Civil War, which at times were not the most flattering. Nonetheless, as satirists, there was a time to be humorous and there was a time to be respectful. And this is very much the Punch artists, with this illustration by John Tenniel, giving a tribute, a commemoration to the dead Lincoln. The illustration is titled "Britannia Sympathises with Columbia," Britannia being the goddess personifying the British Isles, and Columbia being goddess of the Americas. Besides the two goddesses, you can see a freed slave crouching in the corner beside Lincoln's bedside. There is an accompanying obituary poem that reads as follows: "You lay a wreath on murdered Lincoln's bier, you who with mocking pencil want to trace, broad for self-complacent British sneer, his length of shambling limb, his furrowed face, his gaunt gnarled hands, his unkempt bristling hair, his garb uncouth, his bearing ill at ease, his lack of all we prize as debonair, of power or will to shine, of art to please. You whose smart pen backed up the pencil's laugh, judging each step as though the way were plain, reckless so it could point its paragraph of chief's perplexity or people's pain. Yes, he had lived to shame me from my snare, to lame my pencil and confute my pen, to make me own this hind of prince's peer, this rail-splitter, a true-born king of men. My shallow judgment I had learnt to rue, noting how to occasion's height he rose, how his quaint wit made home truth seems more true, how iron-like his temper grew by blows, how humble yet how hopeful he could be, how in good fortune and in ill the same, nor bitterness in success, nor boastful he, thirsty for gold, nor feverish for fame. The words of mercy were upon his lips, forgiveness in his heart and on his pen, when this vile murderer brought swift eclipse to thoughts of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in this eulogy, you get the sense that they are engaging in both a respectful obituary, eulogy, but also a little bit of self-criticism in regards to how they caricatured Lincoln and his rather peculiar looks. And despite all these, despite his peculiar looks, he was the most respectable of statesmen. Since 1994, the Channel Tunnel has been a reality, but it has, in concept, existed for much longer. Here in the Punch magazine issue of January 2nd, 1907, is an illustration titled Hands Beneath the Sea. The two figures in the illustration are Britannia, who is standing at the port at Dover, and she is speaking down to Neptune in the water. Father Neptune, look here, madam, I've been your protector all these years, and now I hear you think of undermining my power. Britannia, well, the fact is I want to see more of my friends over there, and I never look my best when I've been seasick. Now this wasn't a one-time gag, and not the only time it was mentioned in 1907. If we go to a week later, on January 9th, we find this: the Great Tunnel Question. Horrible results anticipated may entail the need of an actual army. Threatened appeal to the manhood of England. We see that the Times today, in a leading article on the Channel Tunnel, says nothing short of universal military service on the continental model can justify us in weakening by an aided risk the ocean barrier which alone has enabled us to neglect military preparation on a continental scale. We confess that if we believe this, it would convert us into wholehearted hostility to the tunnel project. As it is, it shows clearly enough what the real danger of the tunnel would be, that it would be used as an argument for insisting upon conscription on a continental scale. So what this editorial note is implying is that Britain has long had a professional army, but not a conscript one. This is the accompanying poem that Punch wrote in response to this editorial. It was a district passenger that sat, rocked like a babe within its mobile bed, and passing me his journal pointed at the above remarks and said, some talk of sentiment that keeps us great, an island race whose realm is on the sea, island be blowed a smart and up-to-date peninsula for me. Our sires were Vikings full of virile grog, they laughed, you say, to ride the Channel swell. That may be so, but as for this sea dog, it makes him most unwell. That's why I want a tube arranged below, to let my stomach comfortably packed, achieve the Channel half an hour or so, sooner and intact. Romance of nature's bulwarks? Rot, I say. If I can spare myself one bilious pang, I'll give you Drake and Co. They've had their day, let the whole crowd go hang. But if this placid transit should imply a manhood army as the only sure means to avert invasion entering by the tunnel's aperture, then I am against the project, teeth and claws, for though the Channel turns me vilely ill, to have to help at need my country's cause would turn me sicker still. This illustration is in the 30th of January 1907 issue of Punch magazine, and it shows the actor Herbert Beerbohm Tree flying across the English Channel, it looks, on wings, with a Dover piece on his finger, and the illustration is titled Pax Beerbohmica. Herbert Beerbohm Tree was a famed Shakespearean actor and manager of His Majesty's Theatre. What he was particularly known for was creating Shakespeare plays that appealed to a general audience, not just a high-class crowd and intellectuals. He did this through his focus on detail in the scenery and the realism of the backdrops and the costumes, and to get across an illusion that would spark the imagination of the audience and get them to really take in the story and the words of Shakespeare. He did performances of Julius Caesar, Hamlet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, a 254 consecutive day run of Henry VIII, and was in fact adapted into a film with Beerbohm reprising his role. Incidentally, it should be noticed that by his mistress he was the father of Carol Reed, the later acclaimed British film director who directed such classics as The Third Man, and also, via another of his illegitimate children with that same mistress, Beerbohm was the grandfather of hell-raising actor Oliver Reed. This is to say, he kept busy. What this cartoon is satirising is Beerbohm's visit to the Royal Opera House in Germany at the invitation of the Kaiser himself. Pax Beerbohmica, implying a peace being made by Beerbohm between Britain and Germany, which there was a lot of tension between the two, which would finally flare up 7 years later, in 1914, with the Great War. The text beneath the illustration reads, "The Kaiser, who is preparing a welcome for Mr. Beerbohm-Tree in Berlin, has authorised the statement that the drama is a mediator between nations." So this goes into the idea that cultural exchange can help preserve peace and create friends even. And also this is reflected in modern ideas of notions of soft power, for instance. So this cultural figure, Beerbohm-Tree, famed Shakespeare actor, going to Berlin, visiting the Royal Opera House at the Kaiser's invitation, shows a friendship between the slightly strained cousins that were Germany and Britain of the time. Au revoir. That is the title of this illustration from the 20th of February 1907 in Punch magazine. What it is depicting is the theft of two paintings, Thomas Gainsborough's Nancy Parsons and Joshua Reynolds' Honourable Miss York. The text in this illustration reads, "Gainsborough's Duchess of Devonshire to Nancy Parsons and the Honourable Miss York, who were cut from their frames by a burglar last week. Never mind, my dears, I was stolen too, you know, but I came back again, more popular than ever." Now, both these paintings being stolen were unskillfully cut from their frames. They had been in the home of Mr. Charles Wertheimer in Norfolk Street, Park Lane, London, and the art burglary in total, including these paintings, snuff boxes and other articles, all added up to over £70,000 worth of goods. And the Punch cartoonist is here reminding the readers of the earlier theft of the painting by Gainsborough, the Duchess of Devonshire. But these two paintings here, Nancy Parsons and the Honourable Miss York, have never been recovered. Part of the reason for this might simply be because of the theft. Photographs of both paintings were put in magazines and newspapers all around the world, so suddenly it was too high risk to try to sell them on to a fence or anyone, so they were probably stored somewhere and who knows their fate. Sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. This illustration from the 24th of April 1907 depicts a joke that we're probably all familiar with when referring to house hunting, particularly in England and especially in London. So here we see house hunting AD 1400. The kitchen. It's a wide open hall, an enormous fireplace at the back. The squire and his lady are standing in one corner with the person holding the keys stretching out his hand to show how vast the chamber is. Now, flat hunting, AD 1907, the kitchen. These figures can barely fit in the room altogether. There's a small coal scuttle or pot, what it looks like in the background, and their heads are nearly reaching the ceiling, especially as the gentleman is wearing a top hat. What this is showing is how once upon a time you could tour a house with a kitchen the size of a grand hall, but now all you get is a squished in, cosy flat. Ooh, spooky socialism. Who's afraid? Arthur Balfour. I'm not a bit afraid. Henry C.B. Oh, yes you are. Arthur Balfour. Well, I'm not so afraid as you are, anyhow. This illustration depicts Henry Campbell Bannerman, who was Prime Minister from 1905 to 1908, who was a liberal in support of free trade and a general pragmatist. Opposite him is Arthur Balfour, who had been Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905, and was very much a traditional conservative, defender of the establishment and the balance of church and state. This illustration is from July 31st, 1907. Now, both these sides were in some ways in opposition to socialism. Liberalism sought to reform carefully, but feared that socialism would impede individual enterprise. Conservatism, on the other hand, feared that socialism would bring in state control that was quite simply godless. That's where the aspect of balance between church and state comes in with Arthur Balfour. Now, the socialist spectre may perhaps refer in some sense to the Labour Party, which had been founded in 1900s and was much more to the left than the Liberals, who were centre, leaning slightly to the left. What this illustration seems to communicate to me, though, is not so much the terror of socialism, but the farcical nature of both the Liberals and the Conservatives' fear of it. It is just a dressed-up scarecrow with a sheet saying socialism, and they are terrified out of their wits. What the Punch cartoonist is doing is satirising the fear of both the Liberals and the Conservatives in the face of socialism, which perhaps isn't quite as scary as some may think. As on land, so at sea. That's the premise of these two illustrations. This first one coming from the 14th of August 1907 and titled Luxury at Sea. Now, what is this luxury? As you can see, there's a mechanical horse with a naval officer, by the looks of it, being bucked off it. The text of the illustration reads, "The latest addition to the gymnasium of the German transatlantic liners is an invention by aid of which horse exercise may be enjoyed. The above sketches are supposed to represent a demonstration by the ship's doctor, under whose charge such a thing should obviously be put." So here the ship doctor is trying to keep hold of the horse and getting bucked off onto the ground. The next illustration too shows what happens when you put something that's traditionally taking place on land at sea. We all like going to the theatre, and with the new grand ocean liners coming into being that allow for luxury travel, something that has arrived on the ship, which once would have been on the land, is the stage, the theatre stage. This is the Atlantic stage. Coming on the 6th of November 1907, this illustration is titled The Atlantic Stage, and it depicts what happens when you put a stage, with all its scenery, on a ship. Here you see a scene from Hamlet where it looks like a ghost is falling from the rafters. Here you see the famous balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, but here it's losing a touch of its romance as the window seems to have fallen on Juliet's head. Down here, Lady Macbeth seems to be running off the stage, feeling a tad seasick. And then down here, on the bottom right, you see the entire cast being thrown to the left of stage. Both these illustrations, the earlier one with the rocking horse, if you will, and this showing the play falling apart while the ship tilts this way and that, both are showing a satiric view of ocean travel as a luxury. Here I have an old one-penny piece. You may be able to see Britannia with her trident, a little lighthouse in the background, shield bearing the Union flag. Britannia is a goddess of the sea and a defender of the island of Great Britain. Now, this penny is from 1962, but this illustration is from 1907, September 18th to be exact. What it shows is a proposed one-penny piece by the Punch artist, displaying Britannia not on the land defending the sea, but rather in the air, floating over modern warships, the classic lighthouse in the distance as you can see at the bottom, and holding, instead of a trident, some sort of horn. The title is The New Penny, and the text reads, "Designed in accordance with Britannia's aerial ambitions." Now, what were these aerial ambitions, and why in September 1907 were they being mentioned? Well, a clue can be seen in the Latin words on this illustration, nulli secundus. The Latin phrase nulli secundus means second to none, and as well as being the motto of the Coldstream Guards, it was also the name of Britain's first military aircraft, British Army Dirigible No. 1, christened nulli secundus. It was first flown on the 10th of September 1907, so 8 days before the publication of this illustration. The airship's lifespan, however, was relatively short. It was retired on October 10th, so literally 1 month after its first maiden flight, and it was adapted into a new airship, Nulli Secundus 2, which, well, I shouldn't have to say why Second to None 2 is slightly humorous as a name. It seems a bit like a British farce there. Second to none but one. Anyway, that ship too only lasted one flight to train naval officers, but Nulli Secundus did live on in rather interesting manner, as its engine was used for Britain's first military aeroplane, Cody 1. Of course, this was never to be a new penny design, but if it was, to be honest, even though it is satire, it would be quite fitting. Now, what this illustration from Punch magazine on the 23rd of October 1907 depicts is a complaint that can be heard even to this day. It is that men's clothes, generally speaking, can seem quite dull and samey. The title of this illustration is More Beautiful Clothes for Men, with the text reading, "Why not make a beginning at Westminster next session?" implying that they should dress in this manner at the next state opening of Parliament. It's dedicated to Mr. Lewis N. Parker, who says that at present women have no idea what men could look like if they were only given a fair chance. Here you see a range of elaborate outfits that could fit in quite nicely in the Cavalier era all the way up to the Regency period. Throughout the 1800 and into the early 1900s, men's clothes, generally speaking, lost their frills, their lace, their elaborate embroidery, many of their colours, their patterns, and became the simple suits that you can see in photographs that were all of a similar kind, albeit some more tailored and expensive than others. Now, if I were to choose out of these outfits, I say I would look best in probably number 2 or number 5. Which do you prefer? The Esperance Girls' Club was one of a great many movements in England during the early years of the 1900s that sought to revive old English folk customs. Here you see a Morris dancer's scene with Mr. Punch himself leading the dance. The title of this illustration from the 13th of November 1907 is Merry England Once More. It reads, "In consequence of the great success of the Esperance Girls' Club in promoting the revival of English folk songs and Morris dances in country villages, a conference is to be held on November 14th at the Grapple Gallery for the purpose of furthering this admirable scheme." See article on page 347. The article that it is referring to is on the page overleaf and reads as thus. Come, lasses and lads, among many movements that have for their excellent object a return to the land and the cultivation of old simplicities, none wears a more inviting mien than that which originated with the Esperance Club for Working Girls some 2 or 3 years ago, and has, by this time, attained to such a stature that a public conference is to be held at the Grapple Gallery on November 14th to consider the steps by which it might be, if not exactly nationalised, at any rate organised to the full. We refer to the revival of folk songs, games and Morris dances, which, under the direction of Miss Neal and Mr. H. C. McQuellin of the Esperance Club, and Mr. Cecil Sharp, the musician, has led several charming performances at the Queen's Hall, where such enthusiasm was enkindled that, through the generosity of certain of the audience, in many villages of England at this moment teachers are at work instructing the children in the steps of those delightful measures to which our ancestors danced when England was merry. In this way, the Esperance Club, through the public spirit of a few individuals who love the past, has become a missionary centre to spread happiness and fun and melody east and west and north and south. But the club is small and its exertions are limited, and hence this conference for the search of a practical way to increase the number of teachers and so give the songs and dances to a wider and wider and wider recognition until all England is dancing and singing once more and once more is merry. Mr. Punch wishes the conference success with all his heart. You can see here the active enthusiasm of the Punch illustrator and its writers in promoting this venture to bring back the old folk songs and folk dances which reminded people in the early 1900s of merry old England, a rural, simple place, before the Industrial Revolution smogged it up and made life a lot more complicated and a lot more by the clock. It looks charming. Just how should sculptures depict well-renowned figures in their statues? What this shows is an alternative to the heroic model that is currently on display in London. Here you see three statues: the statue of Boudicca over at Westminster Bridge, Nelson's Column at Trafalgar Square, and Charles I. The illustration is titled The Real Realism, and the text reads, "A correspondent of the Daily Chronicle writes with reference to the proposed statuary on the Constitution Hill Arch that it raises anew the questions of the impropriety of erecting sculptured representations of the human figure, as well as of animals generally, in positions which they could not or would not occupy naturally." So, to make it more natural, the artist in Punch on the Christmas Day, December 25th issue of the magazine, 1907, shows Boudicca and her daughters being thrown off the plinth along with the horses and their chariot, Nelson at the top of his column grasping on for dear life, and finally King Charles I and his horse looking rather anxious while standing atop their plinth. What this illustration is just a silly one commenting on how some people are far too critical and perhaps don't think about how best to phrase their criticism. This here is an example of realism taken to the extreme and to the farcical. That's what the Punch artists were best at, after all. Punctuation. How do you use it? How do you demonstrate its usage? Well, here in Punch magazine from the 15th of January 1913, the artist has shown, using a horse and his rider as an example, how to use each piece of punctuation here. First, the full stop. Quite simply, the horse has come to a stop and its rider has flipped over the fence. Then, below that, the exclamation. The rider is screaming out as the horse jumps over some obstacle into what looks like a pond. I don't know if they're trying to jump over the pond or into it. At the top right, probably my personal favourite in terms of how it's phrased, the note of interrogation. The question mark, as we know it more dully today. I do like the note of interrogation as a way to refer to it. Well, here the horse is looking at what looks like a dry stone wall while his rider looks on. They're not moving anywhere. How are they going to get past this obstacle? That's the question, the point of interrogation. Finally, below that, the hyphen. The rider is trying to pull his horse by the reins, but it doesn't appear to be moving, the reins themselves making a hyphen, a line across what looks like a stream below them. The title of this piece is The Little Black Marks That Mean So Much, and with this as an illustration, you know how to use each and every one of these little black marks with no further description necessary. While returning from his ill-fated expedition to the South Pole, becoming the second person to reach that point after Norwegian Amundsen and his fellow explorers, Robert Falcon Scott, Captain Scott, Scott of the Antarctic, and his expedition team all perished. Here in this illustration you can see an angel looking down on the carved names of each in the snow, and the title reads, "In honour of brave men dead." This illustration is from the 19th of February 1913. This may seem a little odd, as Scott and his expedition team had all died the previous March 1912. Well, it was only in November 1912 that their bodies were discovered by a search party, which included Norwegian explorer Trygve Grunn. News arriving much slower than it would today, it was only here that Punch felt it fully appropriate to commemorate the dead men. You can read an in memoriam on the opposite page, which reads, "In memoriam, Captain Scott, RN, and his gallant comrades who reached the South Pole in January 1912 and died on their way homeward. Not for fame that crowns a gallant deed, they fixed their fearless eyes on that far goal, steadfast of purpose, resolute at need, to give their lives for toll. But in the service of their kind they fared, to probe the secrets which the jealous earth yields only as the prize of perils dared, the wages of proven worth. So, on their record writ, for all to know, the task achieved, the homeward way half won. Though cold they lie beneath their pall of snow, shines the eternal sun. O hearts of metal, pure as finest gold, O great ensample where our sons may trace, too proud for tears their birthrights from of old, heirs to the island race. This is Punch's way of commemorating Scott and his team. It doesn't have any of the humour one might expect from Punch magazine, but they were not always humourists, and they knew when to be solemn and who was deserving of it. Flicking through these old volumes of Punch, one gets the sense of inevitability. Of course, this is a view in retrospect, but, well, the Great War began in 1914, and this illustration comes from February 26, 1913. What it shows is France and Germany staring at each other in their civilian clothes, but both piled high with weapons on their back. The text reads as follows: "The blessings of peace. Hans and Jacques together," apologies for the French, "and I hear there's more to come." Now what is this more? I'm not entirely certain, but, well, let's look at another illustration, shall we? This illustration is from a couple of weeks later, and it shows the Russian bear opposite the Austrian eagle. So before we had France and Germany, now we have Russia and Austria. The text reads, "Russian bear, a very happy thought has just occurred to me. What about keeping the peace? Austrian eagle, my dear fellow, I don't want to deprive you of the credit of this brilliant idea, but the very same notion had also occurred to me only a moment ago." Both these figures, the Austrian eagle and the Russian bear, are sat atop cannons, facing each other, once again implying a certain inevitability towards conflict. They keep the peace for now, but later is another matter. The final illustration comes a couple of months after this, on the 14th of May. Let me just check my notes. Yes, the 14th of May. Now this half-page illustration is titled "The Impatient Warrior." Here you see a territorial soldier walking back and forth, and it reads, "Territorial put on sentry over stores. 4:30 and no bloomin' war yet." Again, there is the sense that war is not here, but it will soon arrive. What I get from these illustrations is, as I said at the start, a sense of inevitability. Although one might balk at the word inevitability, as it seems to imply almost a fate to go to war at this time in the 1910s, it definitely seemed that it was very likely, and everyone knew that it was very likely. This is just one of those silly illustrations that Punch does so well. It was published on March 12, 1913 in Punch magazine, and is titled "How Scotland Yard Detectives Are Trained." Here you see students following a scent blindfolded, practicing the Sherlock spring on a dummy, hiding in corners, a fine art, learning to detect false hair, whiskers, moustaches, eyebrows, etc. without touching. If this was indeed how Scotland Yard trained its detectives, then I'm sure it worked marvellously. No one likes working on a holiday. This is an eternal truth. Here, in Punch magazine on the 19th of March 1913, it shows an example of this distressing situation. A ministerial bank holiday dream. Oh, to be at Hampstead now that Easter's here. Here you see all the MPs dreaming of being on Hampstead Heath on a merry-go-round, and what a lovely dream it is. You see, this was the first time in living memory, and in fact since 1689, that Parliament had sat on an Easter Monday. The 1689 session had been held for reasons of certain urgency. It was following the Glorious Revolution, when King William III and Mary II had been imported over to replace a papist James, and therefore Parliament needed to put in a new Bill of Rights as well as resolving the matter of succession. This sitting on Easter Monday was much less urgent than the previous 1689 sitting, as it was merely to put through some fiscal policies that needed to be placed into law before the end of the financial year on March 31st. That was the only reason why they lost their Easter Monday holiday. Fortunately, I don't think since then there has been another sitting on an Easter Monday. Now I want you to imagine something now, something marvellous. Imagine that you can be laying back in your very own home, in your comfortable bed, and you can watch, perhaps on the ceiling above you, as this illustration displays, a film. Well, this is a sort of faux advertisement in Punch magazine from the 9th of April 1913 for the home cinematograph for sufferers of insomnia. Here you see a man laying back in his bed, a cinematograph machine aimed up at the ceiling, and what looks like some sort of Western film with a person getting chased by gunmen over a ravine where there's a log, and on the opposite side it looks like there is a bear. Now we today can do this, maybe not watch this exact film, although it looks interesting enough. Now there are a couple of things of note with this illustration, other than it just being silly fun, and I'd like to draw attention to the use of the word cinematograph. Now the cinematograph Lumiere by the Lumiere brothers was the first device to successfully project moving images to an audience back in 1895. So the term cinematograph for a film projector, most often, was still getting some use. There was even a magazine called Cinematograph Weekly. Today we are not so familiar with the word cinematograph, but the venue where films are shown, the cinema, is a direct descendant of the word cinematograph. Aside from the venue of the cinema, the job title of cinematographer, the person who controls the camera and decides upon much of the visual language and look of a film, comes from cinematograph, and the term cinematography, the art of composing moving images. So all these terms, although cinematograph may not be in our lexicon as much today, its descendants very much are. In the cinema, cinematographer and cinematography. Back to the illustration, it is somewhat prophetic, looking into the future, because this very much today is what many people do in bed, whether that be to cure insomnia or to cause it. Forgotten deeds of valour. This is the topic of this illustration from Punch magazine on the 18th of June 1913, and it depicts a group of residents from the island of Capri appealing to Emperor Tiberius. The text goes as follows. A deputation of respectable residents of Capri wait on the Emperor Tiberius to point out that his midnight orgies give the island a bad name and depreciate the value of property there. Here you see Tiberius being fanned by various women in scanty outfits, one playing an instrument in the background and singing. All the probably senators are drinking around him. The columns read, "To the executioner workroom," and on the right, "To the tormentor studio." This is playing off the historic characterization of Tiberius, most well known in Suetonius's The 12 Caesars, as making his villa at Capri a place of depravity and orgies and sexual deviancy that, well, as these residents say, reduce the price of property in the local area. If this was indeed a deed of valour that has been forgotten, I don't think Tiberius would have taken much notice. A lot can change in 80 years, can it not? This is the summer issue of Punch magazine, summer 1921, and it is celebrating 80 years, having first been published in 1841. What we have here to celebrate this milestone of 80 years is a special set of coloured illustrations, as opposed to their usual monochrome, demonstrating 80 years of change. These changes are mostly in regards to outlook, culture and social attitudes. So what has occurred in these 80 years? What has changed so much? Well, the first illustration shows a dancing lesson in 1841 and compares it to one in 1921. Comparing these two styles of dancing, the ballroom to the much later foxtrot, in the upper image from 1841, it looks like the lady's chaperone is sitting in the background, while another lady sits on the piano playing the music. But below, there is no chaperone at all. The outfit is very much less restrictive, and instead of a piano being played, someone is just keeping an eye on the gramophone. But there are more changes than this. Turning over, we see Miss Priscilla Brown began her day with a little exercise, so does her great-granddaughter. These are very different activities, as you see. One much more delicate and restrained, putting a ball for a hoop. The other, what looks like thwacking a ball flying in midair with a racket. Below this is a scene from the seaside, after which she would enjoy a modest bathe. Her great-granddaughter also bathes. The two scenes are very different indeed. Here you see her carefully exiting one of those seaside bathing huts, whereas her great-granddaughter has no such worries. She is in a comparatively skimpy bathing suit and is lighting a cigarette for a gentleman. Men and women being allowed much closer on the beach now than they once might have been for decency's sake. Now, on this double-page spread, it shows two styles, so how a gentleman would assist a lady in getting over some styles when walking out in the countryside. Back in 1841, the gentleman faces away, not looking at the lady as he holds out his hand, whereas in 1921, he's still not looking at the lady, but less out of delicacy than disinterest. The last illustration showing 80 years of change is Miss Angela removes her shoes and stockings. Jumping forward to 1921, Miss Betty keeps hers on. These are two very different outlooks, one removing her stocking to much outrage, and the other not removing them to much confusion. Get sand in them if you're not careful. A lot can change in 80 years, and that's what this lightheartedly shows. Hero worship. That's what modern celebrity culture is often compared to. Well, I say modern. This is September 21st, 1921, and the hero in question is, well, I think we know who he is. Here is what the text reads. Hero worship. Dante, on the 6th centenary of his death. Very gratifying this concourse in honour of the author of the Divine Comedy. Charlie, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid it's because they think I'm a divine comedian. This is joking about how the 6th centenary of Dante may be coming along, but the person of real interest and renown is the divine comedian Charlie Chaplin. This illustration from September 21st, 1921 is making light of Charlie Chaplin's homecoming return to England for the first time in 9 years. Charlie Chaplin's homecoming welcome was very much one for a conquering hero. He was a rags to riches tale of a Lambeth workhouse boy who had gone from obscurity to perhaps one of the most famous, recognisable faces in the world in his tramp character. Wherever Chaplin visited from the first moment he stepped back onto English soil on the 9th of September, he was welcomed by vast crowds that could only be compared to the crowds that would come out for royals at this time. It was very much, in the 1920s, the arrival of the celebrity culture that we recognise today. His visit also served as material for his book, My Wonderful Visit, published in 1922. Now, turning over a few pages, we get another little comment on this wonderful visit. Charlie Mania. Embarrassing situation for a harmless city gentleman possessed of baggy trousers and endowed by nature with splay feet. This is satirising Chaplin's tramp character. You can see the kid is being advertised on the side of a bus there, and this poor gentleman is being mobbed by a whole crowd of people because they believe him to be Chaplin himself. This was very much, in England, during his visit, a time of Charlie Mania. Everyone wanted to see the boy who had gone from a Lambeth workhouse to becoming the world's most recognisable star. Welcome back. Out of all those illustrations, what was your favourite? They all came from 4 volumes of Punch magazine, the 1863 to 1865 volume, the 1907 volume, the 1913 and the 1921 volumes. I seem to have favoured, when deciding on the illustrations for this series of shorts, the early 20th century volumes, so if I ever continue this series, I might look further back into the 19th century, just to give a bit more range. But whatever the case, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe to Phantasoscope if this kind of thing interests you, and please do feel free to post in the comment about, out of all these illustrations, which was your favourite, and what Punch magazine's illustrations more generally do you enjoy. Thank you for watching.